Michael, before I forget it, Chuck and Peggy Newell said to say hello to you. They're doing well and send their best. Chuck is one of the elders and been the minister at the church in Newcomerstown for many, many years. First time I think I was there, Michael was probably 6 or 7 at best. So you know how long ago that was. A long time ago. They're wonderful people, and I had the opportunity to see them earlier today. Ed Beal is celebrating his... Bowen, is he as old as you? Is this his 90th as well? Bowen's going like this, Ed. Ed's birthday is today. I talked to Laverne and Cheryl Wentworth earlier this afternoon, and Laverne reminded me that it was Ed's birthday. I think I put it on Caroline this morning, but that was so early, I would have probably forgotten it. And Ed would probably prefer that I had, but that's okay. Believe it or not, after this evening, we have just 2 more classes in our study of Daniel, and then our summer series will get underway. Our first speaker for that will be Randy Baker. I'll be away the last Sunday of this month, and so Kurt's going to be teaching our class in Daniel, and I'm assuming we will be somewhere in chapter 5 or just beginning chapter 6. Our deacons, who are in charge of our educational program, have not communicated to me their plans for the fall, but I am assuming that we will just pick up our study of Daniel in the fall. Is that correct? Thank you, Michael. Tim is going like this, and Michael's going, so I'll go with Tim and just say, yeah, we're going to go back. First 6 are, from my perspective, pretty easy to take in. The messages of each chapter, I think, are pretty obvious, and yet we've gone slowly because I want you to get the full picture. We are ending our time. We pick up our study tonight in chapter 4, beginning in verse 28. This is the second of the 2 dreams that Nebuchadnezzar experienced. The first one in chapter 2, you may recall, he could not remember. Tell him what he had dreamed, and then the meaning of that dream, and acknowledge that he couldn't do it without God's help because only God knows the future. Never forget that. Believe it or not, I know some brethren who believe that people can predict the future today, and they place a lot of stock in it. My advice is put more stock in the Bible and less in that kind of foolishness, because only God knows the end from the beginning, and he's not revealing it to anyone through any means today apart from his word. In the 4th chapter, where we find ourselves tonight, the second dream is one in which Nebuchadnezzar is able to recount in, I think, rather vivid detail his experience. And so he tells his advisors what he dreamed and then says, tell me its meaning. And they refused. They refused, I suggested to you last week, because they knew that it didn't bode well for the king. And when Daniel is summoned, the first thing he says relative to the meaning of the dream is that, I wish this were for your enemies, because Daniel wouldn't mince words. Here is the dream. This is what it means. Whether the king likes it or not, truth is truth, and he's going to share the truth. Nebuchadnezzar, on the other hand, just says, tell me what it means. Don't hold back. Just tell me what it means. And then Daniel is able to do that through the assistance of God. As we pick it up tonight in verse 28, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the this that we're talking about is the insanity that he will experience. 12 months, the last time I looked, that was a year later, the things that Daniel said were going to happen to the king as a result of the dream that he had interpreted began to unfold. The question that I immediately raise is, why is it 12 months later before the things that Daniel said God has appointed for the king actually come to pass? And I think I may have said last Wednesday night, and I have real difficulty remembering where I said what and to whom I said it. So if it's repetitious, that's good for me, so it's probably good for you. He urged the king, after interpreting the dream, to turn his life around, to do righteousness, to care for the poor, in essence, to clean up his act. And I may have suggested to you, I know I meant to suggest to you, that there is a high probability that the king actually did that. You may have encountered people who were facing some difficulty and they came to you for advice and you gave them some good, sound advice that would help them immensely if they acted upon it, and they may have for a brief time, but as is so often the case, it's not long until we return to our former wayward ways, and I submit to you that that's what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. And so a year later, the things that God had postponed because he saw some improvement in the king hit him full force. And if you understand Scripture, you understand that this is how God operates. In Jeremiah 18, there's a passage that deals with the potter and the clay that you're probably familiar with or ought to be. When a potter works with clay, he's free to do with clay whatever he or she desires. It's on the wheel spinning, and the potter is able to mold it and shape it. If it doesn't take the form that he's seeking, he has the right to just smash it all up, put it on the wheel, and start over again. And Jeremiah argues in some sense it's like that in our relationship with God, whether it be an individual or a nation. And in using that illustration, he was talking about the conditional nature of some of God's promises. And in particular, relative to nations, if a nation is cursed by God because of its wickedness, and that nation suddenly is transformed and becomes a different people with a righteous bent, God will spare them. But on the other hand, if he promises to bless them and they go wayward, he will destroy them because they are not living up to the conditions that he set. The best example that I can cite for you immediately where it is crystal clear is the book of Jonah. Jonah's message to Nineveh, yet 40 days and Nineveh perishes. And he was a powerful prophet apparently because the entire city from top to bottom repented. And God gave them more than 100 additional years, but they ultimately returned to their former ways. And in 611 BC, interestingly, by the same hands that destroyed Jerusalem and Judah and brought the 4 young men among the captives back to be trained to serve in Babylon, was the Babylonian kingdom. It destroyed Assyria and its capital Nineveh in 611. And ultimately, after 3 incursions, the city of Jerusalem and its temple in 586 BC. And that fate came on Judah because they had not honored God's conditions. He promised to bless them and make them essentially a kingdom forever as long as they were faithful to him. But if they rebelled and lived in idolatry, all bets were off. And if you know anything about the history of Israel, they were constantly reverting to idolatry and forgetting the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Here we are, a year after the dream has been told and interpreted. Nebuchadnezzar is on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon, the capital of the empire, beholding all of his accomplishments. I know when we get to chapter 5 and the fall of Babylon that we'll have something to say, or someone will have something to say about the city, the capital, but I'll just kind of set the stage for you. What would Nebuchadnezzar see if he's on his rooftop surveying his creation? He would see, no doubt, the hanging gardens of Babylon. He may see at least a large portion of the wall that protected the city, and this is a double wall. Not just one, but two walls encompassing the entire city, some 17 miles. These are substantial barriers. They're thick and they're tall. There is a man-made lake within the city, and the river flows through the city. And I just went blank. I can't remember if it's the Tigris or the Euphrates. I think it's the Euphrates. That's what happens when I don't write things down. But one of those two major rivers flowed directly through the city and under the walls. Do you know how the Babylonians were able to take the city? They diverted the water and were able to march under the walls in the riverbank. Nebuchadnezzar's impregnable city was not impregnable. It fell almost without a fight, as we will learn in chapter 5. But he's taking all of this in, and there's also a moat around the entire city, and thinking, look what I have done. No one has ever done anything like, I'm just the greatest person in all the world. And you thought Trump was the first to think that. He wasn't. That's what Nebuchadnezzar thought. And God, in essence, said, I will show you who really is in charge. And I wasn't trying to be political there. Unless you had your head buried in the sand, everything the man did was the greatest, the best, more wonderful than anyone else. That probably cost him his office as much as anything, because that grates on everybody. Nobody can long stand someone who is so full of themselves. And again, I'm not trying to be political. I'm trying to set things in perspective for you. This is where Nebuchadnezzar is. And God, who's in charge, says, I'm going to show you who is in charge. The king answered and said, is not this the great Babylon which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? It's all about me. We've had presidents, if you listen to them, and not at this time, I'm not even thinking about our last president, who in every speech used I and me over and over and over again. The proper pronoun should be we, because we are a nation and it's we, the people. Look what we have accomplished with God's help. But Nebuchadnezzar does what sadly often happens to people in positions of power. That power goes to their head, and then God steps in and knocks them down a notch or two. So he's thinking, look what I've done, and God's about to show him what he can do. While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. There are times in Scripture when God speaks audibly from his throne. We're probably more familiar in the New Testament with the three proclamations that are associated with the ministry of Jesus. In his baptism, Matthew 3, his transfiguration, Matthew 17, and there is a third in John's Gospel that most folks seem not to be aware of, where Jesus in essence says, glorify your name, and he says, I have both glorified it and will glorify it. And then there's the occasion in the conversion of Saul of Tarsus where Christ himself spoke to Saul. Everyone heard the sound, but only Saul understood the message. But this is just one example of many where God audibly speaks. Perhaps one of the most familiar in the Old Testament to Bible students is Moses at the burning bush. If you see a bush burning but it's not being consumed, it gets your attention, as it did Moses. And God said to Moses, "Put off your sandals, you're standing on holy ground." Well, who are you? I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This occurred long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died. But, and I've mentioned this before, and I will keep mentioning it because it's so significant, Jesus used that very account to demonstrate that the Old Testament knew of life after life. And it was all based on Jesus' argument that the tense of the verb matters. God did not say, "I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." He said, "I am." They may have been dead, but they still live in the presence of God, and He is still their God. There is life after life. Don't let anyone tell you differently. And so when God speaks, the proper response is to listen. And He doesn't always speak in a booming voice. When Samuel was a youngster living in the house of Eli, one night God called, and Samuel thought it was Eli. Finally, Eli said the next time, simply respond, "Here am I, Lord." And God then instructed him about the fate of the nation and the fall of Eli. But here, He's not addressing a righteous man. He's not addressing a descendant of Abraham. He's talking to the king of the Babylonians. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beast of the field." What a fall. Essentially from the top to the bottom. "You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you." We talked about this when Nebuchadnezzar recounted the dream, and then Daniel interpreted it for him. Again, I say to you, the most common explanation is that 7 periods of time represent 7 years. But I cannot for the life of me find any reason where I could come to that conclusion dogmatically. So I'm just going to say 7 periods of time will pass of indeterminate length. Perhaps a year is represented by each period. Perhaps it is shorter. I don't know. But I know God was in charge, and what God intended, God accomplished. "This will pass over you until," and there's a purpose for that. If God is sovereign, then the things that happen for a reason. There is some purpose behind it. And that's true, good or bad. God does not promise His people that everything that happens to us will be good. It would be wonderful if that were the case. And it certainly doesn't say in the Bible that bad things only happen to bad people. That would make life a lot easier. It at least would give us a viable explanation for suffering that everyone could understand. But Jesus Himself said God makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust, and the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous. But He's in charge. And in this case, there's method to the king's madness. This is going to enable the king to ultimately come to the right conclusion that God is greater than he is. You will, in time, learn that it is the Most High who rules the kingdom of men, or kingdoms of men, if you please, and that he gives it to whom he will, or forgives them. This is universal. God is in control. Now, we talked earlier about God's sovereignty and his will. There is such a thing as permissive will, in which God simply allows things to play out in a certain way. And then there is determinative will. The crucifixion of Christ was part of God's determined plan to redeem man. That's why you read in Acts 2 that he was delivered up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, and by wicked hands crucified and slain. God's plan played out as God planned it. Other times, things just happen and God is able to use them. In the book of Ruth, and Ruth is significant because she ultimately marries Boaz, and Boaz and Ruth give birth to Obed, and Obed ultimately has a son, Jesse, and Jesse has 7 sons, of which David, the youngest, becomes the king, the man after God's own heart. How did all this end up taking place? Because Ruth gleaned in Boaz's field, and the text says it just was her hap. By chance, in essence, she went to the field of Boaz, who turned out to be the near kinsman, not the closest, but next to the closest, and a whole set of things were put into motion that played into God's plan, or his permissive will. So when we talk about the sovereignty of God, we always must consider both his permissive and his determinate will. But what Nebuchadnezzar needs to come to terms with is that God is in charge. Now I pause and say to you that you need to come to terms with that as well. I don't worry about our world and who is governing where, or what is going on and when and where. God is in charge. I can do nothing about it other than to know he's in charge and trust him to make sure that things work out the way he wants. And that's good enough for me. I sleep really well at night for that very reason. And I also don't watch the news so I don't get stirred up. He's in charge. Never, never, never forget that. Sometimes things will go the way you want them to go, and sometimes they won't, but God will still always be in charge. Don't be arrogant like Nebuchadnezzar and so full of yourself that God has to knock you down a peg or two like he knocked this king. Immediately, the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. That's just an awful situation to be in. I think I mentioned to you last week that I hate dirt. I don't have to work with my hands in grease and muck and dirt, and I don't typically get all hot and sweaty. And I'm glad, because I just hate that. Now, once I get that way, it's okay, but boy, I can't wait to hit the showers. And when it's really hot and I'm working in the lawn, and I may in the shower sometimes 2 or 3 times. I just can't stand it. I think the most miserable I ever was in Bombay, India. Mumbai today. I had been up for 48 hours, missed our first flight due to engine problems, up all night in the airport in Bombay, surrounded by armed guards, seeing them hauling people away all the time. Heard one woman scream, "Go ahead and just shoot me." And all these guns are pointed at her. Before we got out of that airport, I was as miserable. I felt as dirty as I have ever felt. We got to Amsterdam, and there's a really neat thing in Amsterdam and some larger airports. There's actually a hotel, and in the hotel you can rent a shower. At that time it was $13. It's probably $300 today, I don't know. That was the best shower I ever had in my life. And I had been in the same clothes for 48 hours. I just wanted to throw them away. I'd left most everything else in India anyway. And remember going out and buying a shirt, and I still have that shirt to this day. I just had to do something. I just can't stand it. Can you imagine? They say perhaps 7 years, I couldn't go 48 hours without just being devastated. I felt terrible. And here he is, his hair is matted and long, and his nails are like claws. And this is the man who was the ruler of the world. But it's what happens when you get too full of yourself. Don't let that happen. At the end of the days, this 7 periods, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. Why did this happen? So he would come to his senses and realize who's really in charge, recognize that there is a God who rules this world. Said, I finally came to my senses, lifted up my eyes, and my reason returned to me. When I read this, I immediately think of Luke 15. Do you know why? Because there's a young man in a distant country, dead broke, feeding pigs and wishing he could just survive on the carob pods. We would call it slop today because that's what we fed our pigs. But I've got nothing. But Jesus said, he came to himself and said, in my Father's house, the servants do better than I'm doing. But he came to his senses. And that's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. His reason returned to him. It finally dawned on him that he was not everything he thought he was, that there was clearly someone far greater, wiser, more powerful. He said, my reason returned to me, and I bless the Most High. We would, I think, be safe in saying the Most High God, the God of Daniel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, praised and honored him who lives forever. If you are to define God today, how do you do that? You can't use physical characteristics because the first thing you'd have to say about God is he's a spirit. God is a spirit, Jesus said, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. I know that someday there will be a great resurrection. I know a lot of people who think their physical bodies are going to be in heaven. But if you read 1 Corinthians 15, you plant one thing, but something else comes out of the ground. You put a physical body in the ground, but a spiritual body is what ultimately we will have. And I don't know what a spiritual body entails. What I do know is that that spiritual body will be like God, like our Lord is now. In fact, John in one of his epistles said when he comes, we'll see him as he is, not as he was, but as he is, and we shall be like him. So God is a spiritual being, and he is eternal. This is the Most High who lives forever. Did you know that you are also eternal in one respect? You never end. God never had a beginning. He will never have an end. We had a beginning, but we will know no end. It will be the end of our choosing, which is what many people don't seem to understand. So you better choose right. We are made in his image, not in physical form, but a spiritual nature or essence that is eternal. People will say, how is that possible? But honestly, can you destroy anything? Can you, Dennis? I'm trying to think of anything, unless we go into the subatomic realm, that can be destroyed. It can be changed. You can change its form. You burn wood, you still get ash and gas. I don't know all the technical, chemical natures. If you're interested, Dennis will be glad to tell you. You change its form, but you don't destroy it. Well, you can't believe that we're eternal. I absolutely believe it. Because part of me is like God, spiritual, the part that matters. It's eternal like God. This is the God. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. That is, He has power that cannot be taken from Him. Kingdoms rise and fall. In the very next chapter of Daniel, in the year 539 BC, the Babylonian kingdom ends. Overnight. But God still reigns. He's still in charge. And His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, as we learned in Daniel 2:44. He's omnipotent. God is also omnipresent. Read the 139th Psalm if you have any question about that. Where can you go where God isn't? Well, the only place where God isn't is hell. The place of utter darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, continual eternal torment. God will not be found there. But you can't hide from Him. He's everywhere. And yes, He knows every thought we think. He hears every word we speak. He sees every deed we do. And again, for people who say, that's just not possible, have you heard of the NSA? You think your texts are just between you and the person on the receiving end? You think that your phone calls are just you and another party? You're kidding yourself if you think that. Every email you ever sent is out there. No matter how many times you delete stuff, it is still out there, and it can be retrieved. If we're capable of that, the little peons that we are, and I'm speaking here, we in the collective sense of humanity, you think that's a problem for God, who is omnipotent, omniscient, all-knowing, and ever-present? That's the God that Nebuchadnezzar has come face to face with. It was a hard way to go, but he's finally there. I hope it doesn't take something like that to get us to come to terms with who God is. And I know that more and more people in our world, and in our nation, sadly in particular, are atheistic or at best agnostic, who just say this life is all there is and do what you want. Good is what pleases you and brings you pleasure, and evil is what causes pain. And just live your life as you want to live it, because this is all you have. No, no, 1,000 times no. Maybe we need something like this to happen to get people to finally come to terms with what Nebuchadnezzar ultimately came to understand. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and He does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. He's in charge of everything. The Eternal One created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. He didn't abandon His creation. According to Colossians chapter 1, He maintains it through the person of His Son. He's very real and very present, as we learned a couple of weeks or so ago from our study of Acts 17. He's not hard to find. In Him we live and move and have our very being. We're all His offspring. Even Athenian poets, centuries before Christ, knew that. Fewer and fewer seem to know it today. He does according to his will among the hosts of heaven, among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Because he's the one that is in charge. You read Romans chapter 1, and Paul indicts Roman society because they worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator. They have dethroned God and elevated man. Sound familiar? And he listed all of the sins that characterized a society like that. It's like reading a modern commentary on today's society. He says there's no excuse because God is seen in his handiwork. The creation around us declares the Creator. Every day when I get up and get dressed, I put my watch on. I don't know why, because I almost never look at it. I look at my phone, but one thing I do know when I do look at it is it didn't just appear on the bedstand beside my bed miraculously one day, out of thin air. Every time I see the watch, I know there was a watchmaker. This is not difficult for anyone to comprehend. Paul is saying in Romans 1, anybody who looks at this wonderful universe, our glorious world, and man himself must know that there is a maker. And we do not control him. He's still in charge, and we have no right to question what he does. We may do that with our children and our grandchildren, and that's actually a good thing. Not enough of that is being done. But when it comes to our relationship with the Lord, with Father, we better know who's in charge and follow their instructions. Or we may just as easily end up like Nebuchadnezzar of old. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. I got it all back, he said. My counselors and my Lord sought me, and if you remember Daniel's interpretation, that tree's stump was bound by iron and brass. That implied there would be a time when the king would return to his sovereign rule. But he needed to learn a lesson first. Well, that time has come. I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. Another way of referencing God. For all his works are right and his ways are just. Don't ever question what God demands or what God does, because he's there, we're all down here. We have no right to argue with our Maker. My dad lived to be 91. I was around him all of my life. And not one time, I'm serious here, not one time did I ever say to him, "What are you talking about? How dare you tell me to do this? You don't know a thing." When he told me to do something, I did it. Didn't always agree with it. Didn't always do it with a cheerful attitude, but I did it because I knew who was in charge. And I think a lot of us my age, I'm not so sure younger people can always relate to that, but folks my age knew what it was like to grow up with parents who were more interested in being parents than your best friend. And they tried to point you in the right way, the straight and narrow. And if you had the kind of respect that the position demands and deserves, you don't argue, just obey. And if you do argue and you do disobey, there are consequences severe at times. And if we can understand that in a parental sense today, how much more so must that be true in our relationship with God? And furthermore, For all his works are right, his ways are just, and for those who walk in pride, he's able to humble them. Take my word for it, the king says, I know firsthand what he can do. Bismarck said, I make it a point to learn not from my mistakes, but from the mistakes of others. And I've always thought that's a really good attitude to have. Because if you can learn from the mistakes of others and not make the same mistakes, you eliminate all the heartache and difficulty that comes when you make mistakes on your own. We ought to learn from this powerful story to just let God speak through his word and then obey. Don't argue. So, Daniel chapter 4 comes to a close. And God willing, chapter 5 begins next week. And again, it's a very familiar story. The handwriting on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now, what does it mean? And how would you react if suddenly and dramatically the big white screen behind me, the hand appears and the words are written? Would you be frightened? I would. Curious? Absolutely. Capable of knowing the meaning? No more than King Belshazzar. I would need help. And he got help from, you guessed it, Daniel. And again, the message is not good, not for the king or for Babylon, but it turned out again good for Daniel, and that's where we will be next week.